Lucille and Yvette Saywell were sisters. When Lucille was 9 years old and Yvette was 7, a shocking thing happened in their family. Their mother, Cynthia, left their father and ran away with a young, poor man. The sisters' father, Arthur Saywell, was a vicar. He was a handsome man and a good husband. The vicar's neighbours were very surprised. Why had the vicar's wife left him? Lucille and Yvette did not know why their mother had gone away. Perhaps she did not love them. Perhaps they had not been good daughters. The vicar was offered a job as rector of Papelwick, a small village in the north of England. So the family went to live in the rectory, which stood just outside the village. The rectory was an ugly stone house with the river Papel running just beside it. The rector's mother and his sister, Aunt Cissy, came to live with the rector and his 2 daughters. The rector's mother, or Granny as the girls called her, was over 70 years old. The rector was very upset that his wife had left, so Granny never spoke about Cynthia to her son. But secretly, the old woman was pleased that Cynthia had run away. Granny was now the most important person in the house. She controlled everybody else, so that they did what she wanted. She liked controlling the family very much. If Cynthia came back, everything would change, and Granny did not want that to happen. Lucille and Yvette remembered their first home in the south very clearly. They also remembered their mother. She had been like the sun. She was beautiful and bright, but also dangerous. She had brought light and life to the house, but she had also been selfish. As Granny grew older, she became almost blind. She could not read, and somebody had to lead her about because she could see very little. She did not get out of her bed until midday, but she controlled all the other people in the house. The rector especially loved his younger daughter, Yvette. Yvette was like her mother in many ways. She was beautiful, but careless. The rector spoiled Yvette, and he let her do everything that she wanted. So, as Yvette grew up, she did not care very much about other people's feelings. The rector's sister, Aunt Cissy, was almost 50. She spent all her time taking care of Granny. Cissy did not complain, but inside she felt angry. She had no life of her own and no future. She had no time for herself, and she had nothing to look forward to. Yvette was young and beautiful. She never tried to understand Aunt Cissy's feelings, so Aunt Cissy was jealous of Yvette and hated her. When they had finished their education in England, Lucille and Yvette were sent to a school in Switzerland for a year. They returned to the rectory at Papelwick when Lucille was 21 and Yvette was 19. They were tall, attractive young girls with fresh, bright faces. Their hair was cut short, in the modern style. It was a summer day, and Yvette and Lucille were coming back to England. They were crossing the Channel by boat from France. The girls were not looking forward to living at the rectory.
"Papelwick is such a boring place," said Yvette. "There are no interesting young men living near the village."
"Yes, there are," said Lucille. "The Framley family lives in the village, and Bob Framley is a nice young man. And you know that Jerry Summercoats adores you."
"But men who adore me are very boring," said Yvette. "I would like to fall deeply in love."
"I wouldn't," said Lucille. "I would hate to fall in love. Perhaps you would hate it too if it happened."
"But won't you hate to go back to Papelwick?"
said Yvette. "Not really," said Lucille. But I suppose that we'll get rather bored there. I wish that Daddy would buy a car. We'll have to ride our bicycles everywhere." As the ship came closer to the south coast of England, Yvette and Lucille watched the cliffs of Dover. The walls of rock were usually white when the sun shone. But today, the sky was grey and dull, and the cliffs were grey and dull too. The two girls looked tall and confident, but they were just young girls who knew nothing about life. They were like ships that were moving from a safe harbour onto the wide and dangerous sea. As soon as they went inside the rectory, Lucille and Yvette felt depressed. The hard stone walls seemed ugly and unclean. The furniture seemed ugly and unclean too. Nothing was fresh. The food they ate was terrible. Granny was given special things to eat, and grey-faced Aunt Cissy ate very little, only one boiled potato at dinner. She never ate meat. Cissy hated food and eating. Granny was now over 80 years old. It was easy for her to control her son. When Arthur Saywell's marriage went wrong, he had realised that life outside the family could be difficult and dangerous. Only life inside the family was safe. So he stayed close to the family and his mother, the most important person in the house. The countryside round the village of Papplewick was dark and dull, with steep hills and deep, narrow valleys. All the houses in the village were made of stone. Life in Papplewick was as dull as stone too. Lucille got a job in the city as a secretary. She travelled to and from the city every day by train. Both girls helped the poorer people in the village. But Yvette left the rectory whenever she could. Sometimes she had tea with the wives of men who worked in the factories. She liked talking to the working men. Their world was very different from her own life in the rectory. The months passed. Yvette went to lots of parties and dances. Sometimes friends came in their cars and took her to the city. But she never seemed to be really happy. At home, she was often angry, and she was rude to Aunt Cissy. The girls hated inviting their friends to the rectory. There were only 4 rooms downstairs: the kitchen, the dining room, the rector's study, and the drawing room. The drawing room was the only room where a good hot fire was lit, so Granny always sat in the drawing room. Whenever the girls brought their friends to the rectory, Granny was sitting in the drawing room. The girls never felt comfortable, and they could not relax when Granny was there. Granny liked meeting people. She wanted to be introduced to all the girls' friends. She wanted to know who the young people were. She wanted to know where they came from and every detail of their lives. When Granny had this information, she took control of the conversation. One afternoon, Lottie, Ella, and Bob Framley, some of Yvette's friends, came to the house. A young man called Leo Wetherell came too. Granny had not met Leo before, so Yvette had to introduce him to her.
"Granny, this is Mr. Wetherell." "Mr. What did you say?" shouted Granny. "You must excuse me, I'm a little deaf. I can't hear properly."
She held her hand towards Leo Wetherell and stared at him with her blind old eyes. Leo felt very uncomfortable.
"We want to go on a picnic tomorrow," said Ella. "We're going to Bonsall Head in Leo's car."
There was a wonderful view from the top of Bonsall Head. From this high hill, you could see across the countryside for miles around.
Did you say Bonsall Head?
asked Granny.
Yes.
There was a silence.
Did you say that you were going in a car?
asked Granny.
Yes,
said Yvette. In Mr. Wetherell's car.
I hope that he's a good driver,
said Granny.
The road to Bonsall Head is very dangerous.
Leo is a very good driver, said Yvette.
Not a very good driver,
said Granny. He is a very good driver, shouted Yvette. Then Aunt Cissy came into the room. Following her was the maid, who brought tea and a plate of little cakes. Several minutes later, Lucille returned from her job in the town. She was very tired and had black marks under her eyes. When she saw all the people in the drawing room, she gave a little cry of surprise.
You've never spoken about Mr. Wetherell to me, have you, Lucille?
said Granny. I don't remember, said Lucille.
You can't have talked about him, said Granny. I've never heard his name before.
Yvette was eating the little cakes. Without thinking about anyone else, she took another cake from the plate. Aunt Cissy felt very angry with Yvette. She picked up her own plate, which had one small cake on it, and offered it to Yvette. Would you like my cake, too? She asked, in a voice that was polite, but cold with anger. Oh, thanks, said Yvette carelessly, taking Aunt Cissy's cake as well. Now she had 2 cakes on her plate. Aunt Cissy's face showed her feelings of hate. But Yvette did not notice that anything was wrong. Lucille and Yvette felt very tired when their friends left. The conversation between their friends and Granny had been very difficult. Yvette looked at her grandmother. Granny looked like a kind, weak old lady, but she was very strong. She wanted to control other people by knowing everything about their lives. She was like a fat old toad that Yvette had seen in the garden one day. The toad had sat by a beehive. It had caught and eaten the bees as they came out of the hive. Next day, the weather was dull and grey. The roads were wet and slippery because it had rained for several weeks. But the young people still wanted to drive up to Bonsall Head. There were 2 men in the group, Leo Wetherell and Bob Framley. And there were 4 girls, Lottie and Ella Framley, who were sisters, and Lucille and Yvette. The young people all got into Leo's car. As he drove through the quiet villages, they all talked and sang songs. The car went along the road through dark trees and then began the long, slow climb up to Bonsall Head. At the top of the hill, there were no trees. There was only grass. On each side of the road, there were low walls made of stone. Above the hills, the sky was dull and grey. "Shall we stay here for a moment?" said Leo, stopping the car. "Oh, yes!" cried the girls. Leo turned off the engine, and they all got out of the car. The view from the top of the head was wonderful. All around they could see hills and deep valleys, and towards the north they saw a train moving slowly in the distance. "Come on," said Leo. "Let's drive down to Amberdale and have some tea." The friends got back into the car and drove along the top of the head. They were so high that it was like being on top of the world. Up here, it was cold and windy. The young people were silent, looking out across the stone walls. Suddenly, ahead of them on the road, they saw a horse pulling a small green cart. The cart was driven by a man, and an old woman was walking by its side. Because the road was narrow, the car could not pass. Leo sounded the horn sharply, and the man on the cart looked round. But the old woman walked on, and did not turn her head. Yvette's heart gave a jump. The man on the cart was a gypsy. He wore a dark green cap and a big red and yellow silk handkerchief around his neck. He sat on the cart in a comfortable, relaxed way. "Get out of the way!" shouted Leo angrily. The man pulled the horse's reins and the cart stopped. But it was still in the middle of the road and the car could not pass. So Leo had to stop the car too. "Would the pretty young ladies like to have their fortunes told?" said the gypsy, laughing. "Would they like to know what will happen to them in the future?" The gypsy was very handsome, with black hair and a black moustache above very white teeth. His dark, watchful eyes looked at Yvette's soft young face. She looked into his eyes and felt a strange feeling of excitement. It was like a little flame in her heart. "He's very strong," she thought. "He's stronger than I am." "Oh, yes!" cried the girls. "Let's have our fortunes told." "But what about the time?" cried Leo. "It's getting late." "It doesn't matter about the time," said Lucille. The gypsy jumped down lightly from the cart. He seemed a little over 30 years old, and he was well dressed. Beneath his black and green coat, he wore a dark green jumper, tight black trousers, and black boots. Now the young people saw that there was an old quarry on one side of the road. Many years ago, men had cut rock out of the ground, and an opening had been made in the hill. There were 3 caravans in the quarry. The wall of rock rose high above the caravans, curving round towards the road. Grass grew between the rough stones on the ground. The quarry was a good place for the gypsies' winter camp. The old gypsy woman went into one of the caravans. 2 black-haired children looked out of the open door. The gypsy gave a call, and an old man came to take the horse from the cart. Then the gypsy went up the steps into the nearest caravan. At the same moment, a tall and handsome gypsy woman came down the steps. She had big gold rings in her ears and a pink headscarf over her black, wavy hair. She wore a large green skirt. Her face was long, and her eyes were bright and fierce, like a wolf. "Which beautiful young lady wants to hear her fortune?" the woman asked. "If she shows me her little hand, I can read her future." The woman's eyes looked sharply from face to face. Yvette, Lucille, Lottie and Ella all wanted the gypsy woman to tell them their fortunes. They agreed a price, and the woman pulled 2 wooden stools from under a caravan. The first girl, Lottie, sat down, and the gypsy woman looked closely at her hand. She told Lottie about her future life. Yvette was the last girl to have her fortune told. The gypsy woman stared into the girl's face. "I don't think that I want my fortune told," Yvette said nervously. "Are you afraid?" asked the woman. "Do you have a secret? Would you like to go into the caravan where nobody can hear?" "Yes," said Yvette. "I'll go into the caravan." The gypsy woman called something to her husband. The gypsy man appeared at the top of the caravan steps. He was holding a small black-haired baby in his arms. He came down the steps, looking at Yvette as he passed. Yvette followed the woman up the steps of the caravan. At the top, She turned towards her friends. "I won't be long," she said. Yvette's coat had soft grey animal's fur around the collar. The collar was open, showing the white skin of her throat and her pale green dress. She knew that the gypsy man was looking at her as she entered his house. Yvette's friends waited for a long time. It was getting dark and cold. At last the caravan door opened and Yvette came out. The gypsy woman followed her.
"Was I away a long time?"
asked Yvette, not looking at anybody.
"I hope that you weren't bored. Wouldn't tea be nice? Shall we go?"
"You get in the car," said Bob Framley. "I'll pay." He gave some money to the gypsy woman. As Yvette got into the car, she also put some money into the woman's hand. Leo started the engine and switched on the car's lights.
"Good night,"
called Yvette. As Leo turned the car onto the road, Lucille spoke to her sister. "Yvette, tell us what the gypsy woman said to you."
"Oh, nothing exciting," said Yvette. "Just the usual things. My future will include a dark man who means good luck, and a fair one who means bad luck. Someone in the family will die. I'll marry when I'm 23. I'll have lots of money and love, and 2 children. That's all."
At the rectory a few days later, there was a big quarrel between Yvette and Aunt Cissy. The quarrel was about Aunt Cissy's window fund. Aunt Cissy had been collecting money to pay for a new, decorated glass window in the church. This window was to remember the men from the village who had died in the war. Aunt Cissy had asked Lucille and Yvette to collect money for the window fund too. She gave each of them a special money box. The quarrel started when Aunt Cissy asked the girls for the money from their boxes. There was very little money in Yvette's box, only 15 shillings. "But some money must be missing. Where is the rest of it?" asked Aunt Cissy.
"Oh," said Yvette carelessly, "I borrowed it."
Aunt Cissy was very angry with Yvette. Yvette's father, the rector, was angry too. "If you needed money, why didn't you tell me?" he said.
I thought that it didn't matter," said Yvette nervously. "I needed to buy some things for myself. I can pay it back."
"And what have you spent the money on?" her father asked.
"I can't remember," said Yvette. "I gave some of it away."
Yvette's face was very pale. The rector was afraid that Yvette was becoming like his wife, Cynthia. She had behaved in the same careless way as Yvette. Now Yvette looked at him in the same way that Cynthia had done. Arthur Saywell felt guilty and afraid. "You must give the money back to the window fund," he said coldly. "I'll lend you some money now so that you can pay it back. In the future, if you can't trust yourself, don't touch money which isn't yours. You have not been honest. Dishonesty is a terrible thing." Yvette felt very bad. She knew that she had done wrong. She had been dishonest. She had taken money which was not hers, and she had spent it. Why had she touched the money? The rector paid the missing money to Aunt Cissy, but Aunt Cissy could not forgive Yvette. One night, when Yvette had gone to bed, her door opened softly. Aunt Cissy stood in the doorway of the bedroom, pushing her grey-green face forward. Terrified, Yvette sat up in her bed. "Liar! Thief! Selfish little creature," said Aunt Cissy, in a voice full of hate. "You're a selfish, greedy little thief." Yvette opened her mouth to scream, but Aunt Cissy shut the door and disappeared. Yvette jumped out of bed and locked the bedroom door. She slowly got back into the bed and lay there, almost mad with fear. "I wish that I were a gypsy," she said to herself. "I want to live in a camp or a caravan. I never want to go into a house again. I hate this house. There's no fresh air here. I want to live my life freely. I want to live in the fresh air, like a gypsy." Then Yvette thought about the gypsy woman who had told her fortune. She remembered the woman's words. "There's a dark man who never lived in a house. He loves you. Other people are treading on your heart. They will tread on your heart until you think that it's dead. But the dark man will blow the spark of life into fire again. A good fire." Yvette hated the cold rectory. She liked the big, dark gypsy woman who had gold rings in her ears. She liked the woman's strong hands and the gypsy man. Yvette remembered the way that he had looked at her, and her body shook. She had given £2 from the window fund to the gypsy woman. She never told her father or Aunt Cissy this. For several days, the weather was cold and wet. One afternoon, Lucille had a half-day's holiday from her job in the city. The rector was writing in his study. Granny, Lucille, and Yvette were in the drawing-room. The girls were making a blue dress for Yvette. Granny was resting on the couch. Yvette was sitting at the table, sewing her dress. The room was very untidy. There were small pieces of blue material everywhere, and the scissors were lying on the floor. Yvette had placed a mirror on the top of the piano, but she had placed it in such a careless way that it could easily fall. Aunt Cissy came into the room. "This room is in a terrible mess," she said. "You'll have to clear these things away, Yvette." "I'll clear everything away before we have tea," Yvette replied. She got up and pulled the half-made blue dress over her head. But as she did so, she knocked the mirror off the top of the piano, and it fell to the floor. Luckily, the mirror did not break, but everybody got a terrible shock. "Oh, she's smashed the mirror!" cried Aunt Cissy. "It's broken." "Smashed a mirror? Which mirror? Who smashed it?" said Granny sharply. "I haven't smashed anything," said Yvette calmly. "It's all right. Anyway, it's my own mirror. I brought it from our home at the vicarage." "Don't break it in this house, wherever it came from," said Granny. "It's very unlucky to break a mirror. I don't want any bad luck brought to this house." "Oh, I'm not superstitious," said Yvette. "I don't believe that breaking a mirror will bring bad luck." "Yvette, will you please tidy this mess and put your things away?" said Aunt Cissy. "It's really terrible to live with people who are always making a fuss about small things," cried Yvette angrily. "Which people are you talking about?" said Aunt Cissy. "You know who I'm talking about," said Yvette. "I'm talking about the people in this awful house." "Well," said Granny, "thank goodness that there's nobody evil or mad like your mother in our family." For a second, there was a terrible silence. Then Lucille stood up quickly. "You shut up!" she shouted at Granny. Aunt Cissy angrily jumped towards Lucille and began to push her out of the room. "Go to your bedroom," she cried. "Stay in your room until you've apologized to Granny. Say that you're sorry, then you can leave." I shall not apologise, shouted Lucille, and she left the room. Yvette stood in the centre of the drawing-room. She was still wearing the half-made blue dress. She was shocked by what Lucille had said to Granny, but she was also very angry with Granny. The rector came in. "What's wrong?" he asked.
"Oh, nothing," said Yvette carelessly. "Lucille told Granny to shut up when she was saying something."
"Lucille must learn to control her nerves," said Granny. "The mirror fell down, and it worried me. Yvette said something about superstitions and the people in this awful house. I said that the people in this house weren't evil or mad. Then Lucille told me to shut up, but it's only because of her nerves."
Yvette was shocked. Granny was not telling the rector the truth. Granny had said that the girl's mother was evil and mad. Aunt Cissy came back into the room.
"I've told Lucille not to come out of her room until she apologises," she said. "I don't want an apology," said the old lady. "Lucille's nerves made her behave like that."
Yvette's body was shaking inside as she collected her thread, scissors, and other sewing things. She went up the stairs to see Lucille. Halfway up the stairs there was a window. Yvette always looked out of this window, hoping to see someone on the road. The rectory was beside the River Papel. The road curved round the house, down to the bridge over the river, and on up to the village. A horse, pulling a green cart, was coming down the road. It was driven by a man who was sitting on the front of the cart. He was wearing a green cap. It was the Gipsy. At the back of the cart there were metal pots and pans and long brushes. The Gipsy crossed the bridge and passed along the road by the rectory wall. He looked up at the old stone house and saw Yvette standing at the window. He nodded his head to her. Yvette was still wearing the blue dress, but it had no sleeves. Because she was a little cold, Yvette rubbed her hands along her pale arms. The Gipsy stopped at the white gate of the rectory and jumped down from the cart. He took some brushes and other things from the back of the cart and turned towards the house. He looked up at Yvette as he opened the gate. Yvette hurried to the bathroom and put on her other dress. Then she went downstairs to the drawing-room. The maid arrived there at the same time.
"Aunt Cissy," Yvette said, "there's a man selling brushes at the door. Shall I go and see him?"
"What kind of a man is he?" asked Aunt Cissy.
"A man with a cart," said Yvette.
"A Gipsy," said the maid, coming into the drawing-room. Aunt Cissy stood up. She wanted to see the Gipsy herself. The Gipsy stood at the door, holding his brushes in one hand. From his other hand, shining metal objects were hanging: a saucepan, a candlestick, and plates. He looked at Aunt Cissy with his large, dark eyes. "Do you want to buy anything today, lady?" he asked, in a soft, quiet voice. Aunt Cissy saw that he was very handsome, so she did not close the door.
"This candlestick is lovely," said Yvette. "Did you make it?"
"Yes, lady." The Gipsy looked at Yvette, and his eyes showed his feelings for her. She knew that he wanted her. He desired her. It made her feel weak. Aunt Cissy went to show the rector the candlestick, and Yvette was left alone with the Gipsy.
"How is your wife?"
she asked. The man looked at Yvette and smiled. "She's all right," he said. "When are you coming to the quarry again?" he asked, in a low voice.
"Oh,
I don't know, said Yvette carelessly. Come on a Friday, when I'm there, he said. Yvette looked over the gypsy's shoulder at the road. She pretended that she had not heard his words. Aunt Cissy returned with money to buy the candlestick. Yvette turned away and went upstairs. She stood beside the window on the stairs and looked onto the road. She did not want the gypsy to see her. She wanted to know if he had any power over her. Did he control her feelings and her mind? She watched the gypsy walk through the white gate to the cart. He put his brushes and pans away and jumped onto the cart. Then he was gone. No, he hasn't any power over me, said Yvette, and she went to see Lucille. Granny is sorry about what happened, she said. Don't be angry. Let's go down to dinner. Come on, Lucille. When Friday came, Yvette thought all day about the quarry high up on Bonsall Head. She wanted to be there, among the caravans with the gypsies. But she did not go. She stayed at home and sewed her blue dress for a party the next day. She danced with Leo Wetherill at the party. Why don't we get engaged, Yvette? Asked Leo. Leo was an ordinary young man, but he was pleasant and kind, and he was rich. Yvette quite liked him, but she did not want to get engaged to him. What a silly idea! She did not think about Leo's feelings at all. Get engaged? She said. But that's impossible. Since those gypsies told your fortune, I've felt that I am the only one for you, said Leo. And you are the only one for me. Really? Said Yvette, very surprised. Really? You felt the same thing, didn't you? He said. Do you feel the same about me as I feel about you? What? Do you think that I want to get engaged? She said. No. How could I dream of such an impossible thing? The musicians began to play again, and people stood up to dance. Leo looked at Yvette. I won't dance any more, she said. But do go and ask somebody else to dance with you. Leo stood up angrily and walked away from her. Yvette watched the young men dancing. Then, suddenly, a picture of the gypsy came into her mind. She saw his face, his straight nose, his smiling lips. She saw his black eyes, which seemed to look deep into a dark, secret place inside her. The gypsy was so different from the young men around her. Yvette did not want any of them. When Leo smiled at her, his smile did not make a flame burn in her heart. The next week, it rained again. But when Friday came, it was sunny and cold. Yvette told her family that she was going for a ride on her bicycle. But she did not tell them that she was going to visit the gypsies' camp. It was February, and the sun was not strong enough to melt the ice on the ground. But the sun made Yvette think of spring. Her body was warm from cycling, but her hands were very cold. She was not wearing gloves. The horse and cart were not in the camp. The gypsy man was sitting on the ground, making a metal bowl. He was not wearing a coat or a cap. The sun shone on his black hair and green jumper. An old woman was cooking some food in an iron pot over the fire. 3 small children were playing near her. The man looked up as Yvette got off her bicycle. How are you all? She asked politely. All right. Do you want to sit down for a minute? He said, pulling a wooden stool from under a caravan. Yvette went to the fire to warm her hands near the flames. "Are you cooking dinner?" she asked the old woman. "Yes," the woman replied. "Dinner for him. And for the children." She pointed at the 3 black-eyed, black-haired children. They were staring at Yvette. The gypsies, their caravans, and everything in the camp was clean and tidy. The children began to play again like little wild animals. "Are they your children?" Yvette asked the gypsy man. He looked straight into her eyes and nodded. "Where's your wife?" "She's taken the cart to try and sell things. I don't go selling things. I make them, but I don't go selling them. Not often." Yvette sat down on the stool. "You said that you would be here on a Friday," she said, "and the weather was fine today, so I came this way." "It's a very fine day," said the gypsy. "Do you want some dinner? There's meat with some beans in it." "Yes, please. I'll have just a little," said Yvette. "Do you want to come up into the caravan and wash your hands?" "No, thank you," she said. "They're clean." They ate the food, sitting round the fire. The children sat on the ground, eating beans and meat with a spoon or their fingers. The gypsy man was silent. Then the old woman made some coffee. Yvette took off her hat and shook her short brown hair in the sunshine. "How many children do you have?" Yvette asked suddenly. "5, I think," replied the gypsy slowly, looking up into her eyes. He held a cup of coffee towards her, and she took it. She knew that he was sitting there silently, like a shadow. Yvette's hair fell across her face as she put her lips to the hot cup. She felt very weak, as if the gypsy had complete power over her. And as he drank his own coffee, he looked at her. "Do you want to go to my caravan now and wash your hands?" he said. "Yes, I think so," she said. He got up quietly. Then he spoke a few words to the old woman and climbed up the steps to his caravan. Yvette stood still at the bottom of the steps. Suddenly they heard the sound of a car. A big, powerful car passed the quarry, then stopped. The gypsy came down the steps of the caravan again. "Put on your hat," he said to Yvette. Yvette went back to the stool by the fire. The gypsy picked up his tools and began working on the metal bowl again. "May we warm our hands at the campfire?" said a voice. A small woman came towards the fire. She was wearing a fur coat, but her body was shaking with the cold. A large, fair-haired man was following her. He was tall and strong, with a body like an athlete's. The woman sat at the fire and held her hands towards the warm flames. The gypsy was still making his metal bowl. The big blonde man went over to him. "We're on our honeymoon," the woman said to Yvette. "But it's a honeymoon before we're married." "Really?" said Yvette. She was surprised. "Yes. Have you heard of Simon Fawcett?" the woman asked. She was talking about a rich, well-known engineer in northern England. "Well, I'm Mrs. Fawcett. My husband is divorcing me. As soon as the divorce is complete, I'm going to marry this man, Major Eastwood." She turned round and looked at the large blonde man who was talking to the gypsy. Then she looked at the gypsy. Her big brown eyes shone. "He's a handsome man," she said. "Yes, quite handsome," said Yvette. "Are you cycling?" asked the woman, looking at Yvette's bicycle by the caravan. "Yes, I'm going down to Papelwick," replied Yvette. "My father is the rector of Papelwick." Major Eastwood came and stood by the fire. "We were talking about the war," he said. "I thought that I remembered that man's face. He served in my regiment. He took care of the horses. He was excellent."
"Why don't you come with us in our car?" said the woman to Yvette. "We live in Scoresby. That's near Papplewick. We can tie your bicycle onto the back of the car."
"Thank you. I think that I will," said Yvette.
"It's going to snow," said the woman, looking up at the cold grey sky. She closed the collar of her fur coat around her neck. "Are you going back in the car?" the gypsy asked, looking at Yvette.
"Yes," she replied. "The weather changes very quickly."
Yvette did not know what the gypsy was thinking, but she was not very interested. She was more interested in Mrs. Fawcett. This woman had left her rich husband and had run away with Major Eastwood, a poor man who was 5 or 6 years younger than her.
"Well, goodbye,"
said Mrs. Fawcett to the gypsy.
"Thank you for the warm fire."
"Fire is free for everyone," said the gypsy.
"Goodbye,"
said Yvette.
"I hope that it doesn't snow."
"We don't worry about a little snow," said the gypsy. And Yvette followed the woman in the fur coat to the car. Yvette was excited about her new friends. She called them the Eastwoods. They were renting a small cottage near the hills. Mrs. Eastwood was 36. She had 2 children, who were both more than 12 years old. She had left them with her husband, but Mr. Fawcett had agreed that the children could live with their mother when the divorce was complete. The Eastwoods were a strange couple. Mrs. Eastwood was a tiny woman with big eyes and curly black hair. Major Charles Eastwood looked completely different. He was a big young man with bright blonde hair and light grey eyes. He looked like a great pale bird of winter. The Eastwoods invited Yvette for a meal at their cottage. Yvette thought that they were very unusual and interesting people. She told Lucille about her new friends, but she did not tell the rector, Granny, or Aunt Cissy. She knew that they would ask her a lot of questions.
"But I don't want you to visit us if your father doesn't know about our friendship," said Mrs. Eastwood. "I'm sure that he won't worry," said Yvette.
Yvette talked about many things with the Eastwoods. On one visit, they talked about love and marriage.
"Don't you want to fall in love and get married?" asked Mrs. Eastwood.
"No, not really," said Yvette.
"But don't you know what love is?" said Mrs. Eastwood in surprise. "Is there no man who makes you feel different?"
"I don't think so," said Yvette.
"Except—" "Yes, there is one man who makes me feel different. The gypsy."
"What gypsy?"
"The one who was a soldier and cared for the horses in Major Eastwood's regiment in the war."
"You're not in love with him," said Mrs. Eastwood in a shocked voice.
"Well," said Yvette, "I don't know. He's the only man who makes me feel different. He really is. He looked at me in a different way from any other man. He looked as if he really desired me, really wanted me."
"What a horrible man!" cried Mrs. Eastwood.
"Do you think that he shouldn't look at me?" asked Yvette.
"No, he certainly should not," cried Mrs. Eastwood.
"But it was rather wonderful. It really was," said Yvette. "And nothing like that has happened in my life."
"I think," said the Major, "that desire for a woman is the most wonderful thing."
"Do you think that the gypsy is special?" asked Yvette.
"If I were you,
I should know," said the Major. "But she can't possibly marry him and live in a caravan," said Mrs. Eastwood, in a shocked voice. "I never said that she should marry him," said Major Eastwood. "And she shouldn't have a love affair," said Mrs. Eastwood. Major Eastwood thought for several moments. "That Gipsy was the best man that we had who worked with horses," he said. "He became ill and almost died. I almost died, too. I was buried for 20 hours under snow. I was only found by accident."
"Oh," said Yvette, "life is so terrible."
Yvette had thought that her father would not worry about her friendship with the Eastwoods, but when the rector heard about them, he was very angry. "I've heard that your new friends are the half-divorced Mrs. Fawcett and her boyfriend, Eastwood," he said.
"They're very nice," said Yvette. "They'll be married in about a month. I like them very much. They both seem such honest people."
"You've got a strange idea about honesty," said the rector. "Eastwood is a young man who lives with a woman older than himself. He lives on her money. The woman has left her home and her children. And you seem to know them very well. Where did you meet them?"
"I was riding my bicycle," said Yvette. "I met them on the road. They came along in their car and we started to talk."
"And how many times have you visited them?"
"I've been to their cottage in Scoresby twice."
The rector looked at Yvette with hate in his eyes. He remembered his wife, Cynthia. Cynthia had behaved like Mrs. Eastwood. Cynthia had left him and run away with a younger, poor man. His daughter liked the Eastwoods. She did not think that their behaviour was wrong. Was Yvette becoming like Cynthia? "Yvette, why do you make friends with people like the Eastwoods?" he said. "Aren't there enough good people in the world for you? You must stop this kind of behaviour, or you will have to live with mad, bad people." Yvette's face became pale. She felt cold with fear.
"But why?" she said. "What have I done? Is it a very bad thing to be friends with the Eastwoods?"
"Don't say any more," said the rector. "I'll kill you before you go down the same bad road as your mother." Yvette looked at her father. The skin of his face was pale yellow, and his eyes were mad with fear, anger, and hate. Yvette felt very cold and lonely. There was a terrible silence.
"Are you saying that I can't be a friend of the Eastwoods?"
she asked again. "You can be their friend if you wish," said the rector. "But if you are, you cannot be with your granny, your Aunt Cissy and Lucille. You have to choose between clean people, like your granny, and people who are unclean in their bodies and minds." There was another silence.
"All right,"
said Yvette at last. "I'll write to the Eastwoods. I'll say that you don't want me to know them." She walked quietly out of the room and wrote a note to Mrs. Eastwood. "Dear Mrs. Eastwood, Daddy isn't happy that I'm visiting you, so you'll understand that I can no longer come to Scoresby. I'm very sorry." After she had sent the note, Yvette felt empty. Her life was dull. Her home was cold and loveless. She thought about the Gipsy again. She wanted him to hold her in his arms and keep her safe from her father. Her feelings for her father had changed. She still liked him, but she no longer loved him. His words had hurt her very much, and she began to hate Granny. Whenever she saw the fat, blind old woman sitting in the drawing-room, she thought of a great toad. After she had sent the note, Yvette saw the gypsy twice. Once he came to the house with things to sell. She stood by the window on the stairs and watched him, but she did not go downstairs and talk to him. The second time that Yvette saw the gypsy, she met him by accident. It was March, and the weather was sunny. Brightly coloured spring flowers were growing in the woods and on the hills and fields. Yvette was cycling along the road. She saw the gypsy coming out of a stone cottage. His horse and the green cart were standing in the road. He returned to the cart with some of his brushes. Yvette got off her bicycle. As soon as she saw him, she loved him. She knew that she loved the way that he moved. She loved his face as he turned silently towards her. She felt that she knew him better than she knew anybody. She knew him better than her sister, Lucille. She felt that she belonged to the gypsy forever. "Have you made anything new?" she asked, looking at the things on his cart. "I don't think so," he said. When the gypsy looked at her, there was still desire in his eyes, but now the desire was less strong. "The old gypsy dreamed something about you," he said. "Did she?" cried Yvette, very interested. "What did she tell you?" "She said, 'Be braver in your body, or your look will leave you.' And then she said, 'Listen for the voice of water.'" "What does that mean?" asked Yvette in surprise. "I asked her that question," the gypsy said. "She says that she doesn't know." Then he was silent as he looked at her soft face. "All right," she said. "I don't understand the words now, but perhaps I'll understand them in the future." She looked at him with clear, shining eyes. "Aren't you coming to the quarry again?" he said. "Perhaps I'll come sometime," she said. "It's spring," he said, smiling and looking round at the sun. "We're going to pack up our camp soon and go away." "All right," Yvette said. "Perhaps I will visit before you go. I'll come and say goodbye to your wife and the old woman who sent me the message." But Yvette did not visit the gypsies' camp at the quarry. She went out with her friends to parties, and she danced with Leo Wetherell. She wanted to go and say goodbye to the gypsies, but she did not. It was Friday afternoon. The weather was fine, and the sun shone brightly on the yellow flowers in the rectory garden. The river Papel was very full of water. The water rushed quickly and noisily under the stone bridge. It was unusual for the river to have so much water in it. Yvette felt very lazy. She did not want to do anything. She walked in the garden by the river. The rector had gone out, and Lucille was at work. Granny was inside the house with Aunt Cissy. Yvette sat on a wooden seat, which was only a few feet above the river. She thought about the gypsies. "The gypsies' camp is a better home for me than here in the rectory," she thought. Yvette looked again at the river. The brown water was rushing past the garden extremely quickly. She remembered the message from the old gypsy. "Listen for the voice of water." Yvette heard a voice calling her name. Aunt Cissy was standing by a door of the house, waving her hand. "Yvette, I'm going to the village," Cissy shouted. "I won't be away for long. Don't forget that Granny is alone." "All right," Yvette shouted back. The sun was beginning to go down. It was past 5 o'clock. Yvette would have to go back into the rectory soon. Once again, she would have to be in those horrible rooms with Granny. She walked by the river. She did not want to go inside the ugly house. Suddenly, she heard the sharp noise of a horse and cart on the road, and somebody was shouting. It was the Gipsy. He was waving his hands at her wildly and shouting. Yvette turned and looked behind her. At that moment, she heard a sound like the roar of a great and dangerous animal. A huge wall of water was coming around the bend of the river and rushing down towards her. The Gipsy was shouting and running across the garden. He pulled her arm and screamed, "Run!" The huge wave of water swept Yvette off her feet. The Gipsy pulled her towards the house. He was trying to take her to the steps that led up to the front door. But before they reached the steps, another wave hit them and covered their heads. The water was as cold as ice. The Gipsy pulled Yvette up again. "Go to the steps," he shouted in Yvette's ear, pushing her in front of him. At last, they reached the steps of the house. Another wall of water came roaring to the house, and the wall shook. The Gipsy pushed open the door, and they were swept inside. The water filled the hall. Suddenly, they saw Granny come out of the drawing room. She felt the water all around her legs and opened her mouth in a cry of fear. Yvette climbed up the stairs. Water poured from her hair and clothes. The Gipsy followed her, his wet black hair over his eyes. From the top of the stairs, they stared at the flood which rushed through the hall below them. Yvette saw Granny's body in the water. Her old face was purple, and her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was trying to hold onto the stairs with one hand. Yvette saw the old woman's gold wedding ring shining on her finger. Another wave of water struck the house, and there was a strange cracking noise. Yvette reached the door of her bedroom. The water moved below them like a wild brown sea. They felt the house begin to move. "The house is going to fall," shouted the Gipsy. "Where is the chimney? The chimney is strong. It won't fall. We must get near the chimney. Then we'll be safe." "Come in here, said Yvette. The chimney was in one wall of Yvette's bedroom. They went into the room, and the Gipsy looked out of the window. Outside, between the house and the hill, there was a sea of water. Broken trees and other things were being swept around in the wild brown flood. There was a terrible noise from somewhere in the house. Walls were falling. "It's all right," said the Gipsy. "This room is safe." He pointed to the chimney. "Look, the chimney is strong. It's like a tower, but we must get warm. Take off your wet clothes and get into the bed. I'll rub you with a towel so that you can get dry. I'll dry myself too." The Gipsy pulled off his wet clothes. He took a towel and began to rub his cold, wet body quickly. Yvette took off her dress. Her body was shaking. The Gipsy went to the door and looked out. The sky was quite dark now. The end of the house that was nearest to the river had gone. The water had swept the walls away. The stairs had disappeared too. "It's all right. The water isn't rising any higher," said the Gipsy. "Get into the bed. Lie under the blankets." Yvette pulled the sheets and blankets over her head. Her body was shaking with cold. Suddenly she uncovered her head and looked at the Gipsy. Make me warm," she cried. Her teeth were snapping together between each word. "I will die from the cold." The Gipsy nodded his head and held her in his arms. His body was shaking too. He held her body tightly against his own body. Slowly they began to feel warm again. At last they slept. The next day the sun was shining in a beautiful blue sky. The bridge had broken and disappeared, but the water had stopped rising. Most of the rectory had been destroyed in the flood. The southwest corner of the house was now a great pile of mud and stones. By midday, men from Papplewick village arrived at the rectory. They used ladders to get across the river to the house. In the kitchen, they found Granny's body among the mud, trees, and broken furniture. Then more villagers came, running down the hill. They had a message from the old Gipsy. He had said that his son had been near the rector's house. He had seen Yvette at the top of the house. Everyone began to search for Yvette. The men put a long ladder up to the window of her bedroom. A policeman from Papplewick climbed up the ladder and broke the glass of the window. He saw Yvette lying in the bed, asleep. The noise of the breaking glass woke her. She sat up suddenly, holding a blanket around her. The policeman shouted to the people below, "Miss Yvette's in bed!" "Don't be frightened, miss," he said to Yvette. "Don't worry any more. You're safe now." Yvette did not understand. Was the policeman talking about the Gipsy? Where was her Gipsy? What had happened to him? He had gone, and a policeman was looking into the room. "If you get dressed, miss, we'll take you down to safe ground," said the policeman. "You can't stay here. The house will probably fall." The policeman turned his head away and waited. Yvette took some clothes from a cupboard and put them on. The Gypsy's wet clothes were no longer on the floor. There was just a wet mark on the carpet. Yvette called to the policeman. "We must get out of the house as soon as possible, miss," he said. "The house may fall." "Really?" said Yvette calmly. "Is it as bad as that?" She heard shouts from outside. She went to the window and looked out. There, below, was her father. The rector's arms were wide open, and tears were running down his face. "I'm all right, Daddy," Yvette said calmly, and tears began to run down her own face. "Don't cry, miss, don't cry," said the policeman. "The rector has lost his mother, but he's very thankful that you're alive." "Is Granny drowned?" asked Yvette. "I'm afraid that she is dead, poor lady," said the policeman. "Can you go down the ladder, miss?" Yvette looked at the ladder. It did not look safe. But then she remembered the words of the old Gipsy. "Be braver in the body." "Oh, yes," she said. At the bottom of the ladder, she ran into her father's arms. Later, a car took Yvette and her father to the Framleys' house. Lucille and Aunt Cissy were waiting there. Lucille cried when she saw that her sister was safe. Even Aunt Cissy was happy that Yvette was safe. "I can't cry about Granny now that Yvette is alive," Aunt Cissy said. The flood had happened because of a great reservoir 5 miles from the rectory. The reservoir contained a huge amount of water, but the wall of the reservoir had become weak and had suddenly burst. The water had rushed through the broken wall and down to the village in a great flood. Yvette did not tell anyone that the Gipsy had been in her bedroom. She only said that he had taken her inside the house. She said that she had climbed up the stairs alone. But Yvette knew that the Gipsy had escaped. The old Gipsy had come to the village to get the horse and cart. He had said that his son was safe. "We should thank the Gipsy who saved Yvette's life," said Lucille. The rector and his daughters went to the quarry, but it was empty. The gypsies had packed up their camp and left. That night, Yvette lay in her bed and thought about everything that had happened. There was a deep pain in her heart. "Oh, I love him. I love him. I love him," she said to herself. Sometime later, Yvette received a short letter. "Dear Miss, I saw in the paper that you were all right. So was I. I hope that I'll see you again one day. I came that day to say goodbye, but the water gave me no time. Your servant, Joe Boswell." For the first time, Yvette realized that the gypsy had a name.